When Henry III became King of England in October 1216, he did not inherit a throne, he inherited a battlefield. He was only 9 years old, a thin boy with a solemn face, crowned in the middle of a civil war, while his father's reputation still burned like a curse across the kingdom. King John, his father, had died hated by many of his barons, at war with much of his own realm, with a French prince invited to take the English crown. England was fractured, exhausted, and uncertain whether the Plantagenet dynasty would even survive, and yet this child would reign for 56 years, one of the longest reigns in medieval English history. His life would not be defined by conquest, like his grandfather Henry II, nor by crusading glory, like his uncle Richard the Lionheart. Instead, Henry III's reign became a long, complicated struggle over the meaning of kingship itself, a story of faith, art, foreign influence, baronial revolt, and the slow birth of something that would one day be called constitutional government. The boy king's first crown was improvised. London was in rebel hands, so the ceremony took place at Gloucester Cathedral. There was no proper crown, a simple gold circlet was used. The kingdom's survival depended not on the child, but on the men around him, especially William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, one of the greatest knights of the age. Marshal became regent, and his loyalty, reputation, and military skill saved the dynasty. The civil war that had begun under John continued. Rebel barons still supported Prince Louis of France, who had landed in England in 1216, but Marshal rallied royalist forces. In 1217, the royal army defeated the rebels at the Battle of Lincoln, and an English fleet defeated French reinforcements at the Battle of Sandwich. Louis agreed to withdraw, renouncing his claim to the English throne. To win back support, the Regency reissued a revised version of Magna Carta in 1216 and again in 1217, presenting the Charter as a humiliation of royal authority, but as a foundation for peace. The idea that the king was bound by law, forced upon John, became the political inheritance of his son. By 1227, Henry declared himself of age and began ruling in his own right. He grew into a man very different from his father. Where John had been sharp, suspicious, and relentless, Henry was deeply pious, gentle in temperament, and drawn to beauty, ritual, and sacred kingship. He believed profoundly that kings ruled by God's will, and that royal authority had a spiritual dimension. This belief shaped everything he did, and often put him at odds with the political realities of his time. Henry's court became a center of religious devotion and artistic patronage. His greatest legacy in stone was the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey in a new Gothic style inspired by French cathedrals. He transformed it into a magnificent shrine for Edward the Confessor, the Anglo-Saxon king he revered almost as a personal patron saint. Henry saw himself as Edward's spiritual successor, a holy king ruling a Christian realm. But while Henry dreamed of sacred kingship, his barons remembered something else: Magna Carta. They believed it guaranteed limits on royal power, fair governance, and protection from exploitation. The tension between these visions, divinely ordained monarchy versus rule constrained by law and consent, defined the reign. Henry's early years of personal rule were marked by dependence on favorites, foreign relatives from his mother's side. The Lusignans of Poitou arrived in England and received lands and influence. Later, relatives of his wife, Eleanor of Provence, gained positions at court. Many English barons resented this. They saw outsiders enjoying royal favor, while they themselves were taxed and overlooked. Financial strain was constant. Henry inherited a kingdom that had lost much of its continental territory under John. Unlike his father or grandfather, he lacked the military skill or political ruthlessness to recover those lands. Yet he continued to pursue continental ambitions, particularly in Gascony, the last major Angevin possession in France. Campaigns there were costly and brought little glory. The crisis deepened over a grand but disastrous dream. Henry's involvement in Sicilian politics. In the 1250s, the Pope offered Henry's younger son, Edmund, the crown of Sicily, then under Hohenstaufen control. It was a distant, dangerous venture requiring enormous funds. Henry accepted, committing England to vast financial obligations. Barons were outraged at being taxed for a scheme that served papal interests more than English ones. Discontent turned into organized opposition. In 1258, leading barons confronted the king at Oxford, forcing him to accept reforms known as the Provisions of Oxford. These measures established a council of barons to oversee royal government and limited the king's independent authority. It was a dramatic step. The monarchy was being formally supervised. At the center of this movement stood Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, a man whose life intertwined deeply with Henry's. Montfort had married Henry's sister Eleanor, making him the king's brother-in-law. Brilliant, ambitious, and intensely religious, he became the leader of reformist barons. At first, Henry accepted the new arrangements, but he never believed them legitimate. By the early 1260s, the king sought to recover full authority. Civil war broke out in 1264, known as the Second Barons' War. At the Battle of Lewes in May 1264, Montfort's forces defeated the royal army. Henry and his son Prince Edward, the future Edward I, were captured. For a time, Montfort ruled in the king's name. During this period, something remarkable occurred. In 1265, Montfort summoned a parliament that included not only nobles and bishops, but also representatives from towns, an early step toward the parliamentary system that would later define English politics. Though Montfort's regime was controversial and short-lived, the precedent endured. Prince Edward escaped captivity and rallied royalist forces. In August 1265, at the Battle of Evesham, Montfort was defeated and killed. His body was mutilated on the field. Royal authority was restored, but the issues raised by the rebellion could not be erased. Henry's later reign was more cautious. The king gradually reasserted control, but the political landscape had changed permanently. Consultation with leading subjects became a recurring expectation. Personally, Henry remained devout and artistic to the end. He continued work on Westminster Abbey, poured resources into religious houses, and maintained a court rich in ceremony. His reign saw developments in English law, administration, and architecture. Despite political turmoil, the kingdom did not collapse. Trade expanded, towns grew, royal government became more structured and record-based. His relationship with his son Edward was complex. Edward was everything Henry was not: decisive, militarily capable, hard, pragmatic. Where Henry sought harmony and sacred legitimacy, Edward understood power in harsher terms. By the 1260s, Edward was already the dominant military figure of the realm. Henry III died in 1272, after more than half a century on the throne. He was buried in the Westminster Abbey he had rebuilt, near the shrine of Edward the Confessor. His reign had begun in chaos and ended in relative stability, though not without scars. Historians see him as a paradox. He was not a great warrior king, nor a master politician. He could be stubborn, naive, and overly trusting of favorites, yet he was also sincere, devout, and genuinely committed to justice as he understood it. Under him, the monarchy did not become weaker, it became more defined, shaped by negotiation, law, and precedent. The England Henry ruled at his death was not the England his father had left him. The king could no longer ignore the political nation. The idea that governance required consultation had taken root. Magna Carta, reissued and reaffirmed during his reign, became part of the kingdom's political identity. Henry III's life was not a tale of dramatic conquests or legendary battles. It was a long, uneven pilgrimage of a medieval king trying to rule as God's anointed servant in a world where power was increasingly shared. His failures sparked rebellion. His piety inspired beauty. His reign became a bridge between the harsh feudal monarchy of the 12th century and the more structured, law-bound kingship that would follow. He began as a child crowned in fear, surrounded by war. He ended as an old king buried beneath soaring Gothic arches, having shaped often unintentionally the future balance between crown and community in England. When Edward I of England rode north in armour, the earth seemed to shake with him. He was tall for his age, unusually tall, and his long legs earned him the nickname Longshanks. But it was not height alone that made him loom over his century. Born in 1239, the eldest son of Henry III, Edward grew up in a court filled with piety, art, and political tension. His father dreamed of sacred kingship. His son grew into a man who believed kingship was power, law, and iron discipline. If Henry III's reign had been a long struggle between crown and barons, Edward's would be an age of command. When he became king in 1272, he did not inherit civil war. He inherited the aftermath of one, and the memory of how close the monarchy had come to being mastered by its own subjects. Edward never forgot that lesson. He had already proven himself in war before he wore the crown. As a young prince, he fought during the Second Barons' War against Simon de Montfort, the same conflict that had humiliated his father. Edward was captured at Lewes in 1264, but he escaped the next year and led the royalist army that crushed Montfort at Evesham in 1265. The victory was brutal. Montfort's body was hacked apart, and rebellion died with him. Edward had seen what disorder looked like, and he would spend his reign trying to prevent it, even at terrible cost. When Henry III died in 1272, Edward was not in England. He was on crusade in the Eastern Mediterranean, part of what later chroniclers called the Ninth Crusade. His absence did not trigger chaos. The government continued smoothly in his name, a sign of how much royal administration had matured. Edward did not rush home. He returned only in 1274, after securing his position abroad. That calm transition showed something new. The English crown was becoming an institution, not merely the presence of a king. From the start, Edward ruled with purpose. He was not merely a warrior, he was a reformer of law. One of his earliest achievements was the Great Inquiry, as the 100 Rolls from 1274 till 1275, an investigation into abuses of royal rights and local governance. It was followed by a series of important legal statutes. The Statute of Westminster, 1275, addressed legal procedures and corruption. Later statutes clarified property rights, inheritance, and the relationship between local and royal courts. Edward believed in order, a realm where authority flowed downward from the crown, and where law was clear, enforceable, and written. But Edward's vision of order had a darker side. In 1290, he issued the Edict of Expulsion, ordering the expulsion of Jews from England. Jewish communities had long been under direct royal protection and financial exploitation, but anti-Jewish prejudice and financial tensions ran deep. The expulsion ended centuries of Jewish presence in medieval England. It was a decision shaped by politics, debt, and popular hostility, and it left a moral shadow on his reign. Edward's greatest impact, however, was forged in war. To his west lay Wales, divided among native princes, but increasingly dominated by Llewellyn ap Griffith, who styled himself Prince of Wales. Tensions between Llewellyn and the English crown had simmered under Henry III, but Edward would not tolerate a semi-independent ruler on his frontier. In 1277, he launched a campaign that forced Llewellyn to submit. But peace did not last. In 1282, Welsh revolt flared again. This time, Edward came not merely to discipline, but to conquer. The war was hard and relentless. Llewellyn was killed in battle near Bilthwells in December 1282. His brother David continued resistance, but was captured and executed in 1283. Edward's victory was total. The Statute of Rhuddlan 1284 incorporated Wales into the English crown's domain, introducing English law in many areas while allowing some Welsh customs to survive. To cement control, Edward built a chain of mighty castles, Carnarvon, Comwy, Harlech, and Beaumaris, masterpieces of medieval military architecture. These stone fortresses were not just defences, they were symbols of domination, rising over Welsh landscapes like permanent declarations of conquest. It was after this victory that Edward gave the title Prince of Wales to his son, the future Edward II, a title English heirs to the throne still hold. Wales had not merely been defeated, it had been bound to the English monarchy. To the north lay a different challenge, Scotland. When the Scottish King Alexander III died in 1286, followed by his granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, in 1290, Scotland faced a succession crisis. Competing claimants turned to Edward to arbitrate. Edward agreed, but only after insisting that he be recognised as overlord of Scotland. Under pressure, the Scottish nobles consented. In 1292, Edward chose John Balliol as king, but Balliol soon resisted English interference. Edward responded with fury. In 1296, he invaded Scotland, defeated Balliol, and removed him from the throne. He seized the Stone of Scone, the ancient symbol of Scottish kingship, and took it to Westminster. To Edward, Scotland had been subdued. He was wrong. Resistance gathered around figures like William Wallace. In 1297, Wallace and Andrew Murray defeated an English army at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Edward marched north the next year and won a hard-fought victory at Falkirk 1298, where English longbowmen shattered Scottish schiltron formations. Wallace's resistance eventually collapsed. He was captured and executed in 1305, but another leader rose, Robert the Bruce. In 1306, Bruce killed his rival John Comyn and had himself crowned King of Scots. Edward, now aging but still relentless, prepared yet another campaign. He never saw its end. He died in 1307, near the Scottish border, still intent on war. Edward's wars required money, and money required negotiation. Throughout his reign, he summoned parliaments to approve taxation. The famous Model Parliament of 1295 included not only nobles and clergy, but also representatives from counties and boroughs, knights and burgesses. Edward did not summon them out of democratic idealism. He needed broad consent to fund his wars, yet the precedent mattered. The structure of Parliament, Lords, clergy, Commons took clearer shape under him. His reign also saw conflict with the Church. Disputes over taxation of clergy led to confrontations with Archbishop Robert Winchelsea. Edward was firm. No institution in his realm stood entirely beyond royal authority. In personality, Edward combined sternness with intensity. He was capable of deep loyalty and fierce anger. He loved his first wife, Eleanor of Castile, deeply. When she died in 1290, he ordered the construction of memorial crosses at each place her funeral procession rested. The Eleanor crosses, monuments of grief and devotion. Later, he married Margaret of France, strengthening diplomatic ties. Edward was not merely a conqueror, but a system builder. He strengthened royal justice, clarified feudal obligations, and expanded administrative record-keeping. His government functioned with growing bureaucratic sophistication. Sheriffs, judges, clerks, all operated within a more structured framework than in earlier reigns. Yet his legacy is double-edged. To many English chroniclers, he was a great king, lawgiver, conqueror, guardian of order. To Welsh and Scottish memory, he was a hammer of nations, a destroyer of independence. His castles still stand. So do the stories of resistance he provoked. By the time of his death, England was more centralized, more legally defined, and more assertive than when he took the throne. But it was also entangled in long wars and heavy taxation. His son, Edward II, would inherit not only a powerful monarchy, but also unresolved conflicts and resentments. Edward I's life was a study in will. He believed kingship meant responsibility for order, and that disorder justified force. He rode across Britain, imposing his vision in stone, law, and blood. Where Henry III had ruled through piety and patience, Edward ruled through command. He died as he had lived, on campaign, armoured in purpose, facing north toward an unconquered land. His body was buried in Westminster Abbey, beneath a simple inscription, Edwardus Primus Scotorum Malleus, Edward I, Hammer of the Scots. It was not merely a boast. It was the epitaph of a king who reshaped Britain through law and war, leaving behind a realm stronger, harsher, and forever changed. When Edward II inherited the crown of England in 1307, he inherited more than a kingdom. He inherited a war that would not end, a nobility hardened by power, and the long shadow of a father who had seemed made of iron. His father, Edward I, had died on campaign against Scotland, a king whose name inspired fear from Wales to the Highlands. His son was cut from different cloth. Edward II had grown up in the atmosphere of his father's stern courts, but he did not share the elder king's relentless discipline, administrative focus, or instinct for command. Where Edward I had been formidable and commanding, Edward II was emotional, impulsive, and drawn toward personal attachments that would shape and shatter his reign. He was born in 1284 at Carnarvon Castle in newly conquered Wales, a symbolic birth that followed his father's subjugation of the region. From infancy, he was a political emblem. He became Prince of Wales, the first English heir to hold the title. His childhood, however, was not one of military grooming alone. He loved music, rowing, physical sports, and manual crafts, interests unusual and sometimes frowned upon in a king expected to embody knightly severity. When Edward I died in July 1307, the young king was only 23. The moment he came to power, he made a decision that defined his rule. He recalled Piers Gaveston. Gaveston, a Gascon knight, had been Edward's close companion since youth. Edward I had exiled him, believing the relationship dangerously influential, but Edward II brought him back immediately and showered him with honours, titles, and wealth, even granting him the earldom of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for royal blood. The English barons were furious. To them, Gaveston was an upstart foreign favourite whose influence over the king disrupted the balance of noble power. This conflict between the king's personal loyalty and the political expectations of the realm would define the tragedy of Edward II. Meanwhile, the war with Scotland smouldered. The Scots had not submitted after Edward I's death. Robert the Bruce, crowned King of Scots in 1306, was rebuilding resistance. Edward II, however, was slow to act. Court tensions, noble resentment, and disputes over Gaveston consumed the early years of his reign. In 1308, Edward married Isabella of France, daughter of King Philip IV of France. She was young, politically significant, and initially overshadowed by Gaveston's prominence. The marriage alliance should have strengthened England's position in Europe, but Edward's favoritism toward Gaveston humiliated Isabella and alienated her powerful French relatives. By 1311, the barons forced their will upon the king. A group known as the Lords Ordainers drafted the Ordinances of 1311, a set of reforms that limited royal authority, controlled finances, and most importantly banished Gaveston. Edward reluctantly agreed, but his compliance was temporary. Gaveston returned, was captured by rebellious barons, and in 1312, he was executed without royal consent. His death was a turning point. Edward never forgave the nobles responsible. Grief hardened into bitterness. The kingdom drifted toward instability, just as the Scottish threat reached its peak. In 1314, Edward II led a large English army north to relieve Stirling Castle, one of the last major English-held fortresses in Scotland. There, at the Battle of Bannockburn, Edward faced Robert the Bruce. The English force was larger and heavily armoured, but Bruce's army used terrain, discipline, and tight infantry formations called schiltrons to devastating effect. English cavalry charges failed, confusion spread, Panic followed. Bannockburn was a catastrophe. Edward II barely escaped capture, fleeing the field while much of his army was destroyed. The defeat secured Bruce's position and marked Scotland's effective independence. It also shattered Edward's prestige. A medieval king's authority stood heavily on military success. Edward II had failed where his father had seemed unstoppable. After Bannockburn, England entered a period of turmoil. Scottish raids penetrated deep into northern England. Famine struck between 1315 and 1317, part of the broader Great Famine affecting Europe. Crops failed, prices soared, and starvation weakened the population. A king already viewed as ineffective now ruled over hunger and insecurity. With Gaveston gone, new favourites emerged: Hugh Despencer the elder and his son Hugh Despencer the younger. The younger Despencer became especially powerful, gaining lands in Wales and influencing royal decisions. His aggressive expansion of property and use of royal authority to enrich himself angered many nobles, particularly in the Welsh marches. Opposition turned into open revolt. In 1321, barons known as the Contrariants forced Edward to exile the Despensers. But Edward had learned from past humiliations. He gathered loyal forces, defeated his opponents, and recalled the Despensers. One by one, rebel lords were captured. Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, a leading magnate and cousin of the king, was executed in 1322 after defeat at the Battle of Boroughbridge. Edward now ruled more harshly than before, determined to break aristocratic resistance. Yet repression brought no stability. The Despensers' greed deepened resentment. Edward's governance became increasingly associated with favoritism and arbitrary justice. Meanwhile, trouble brewed abroad. Isabella's brother, Charles IV of France, challenged Edward over territories in Gascony. The English held duchy in southwestern France. Disputes over feudal obligations led to war in 1324. Edward sent Isabella to France to negotiate. Instead of returning, she remained there effectively estranged from her husband. In France, Isabella formed an alliance with Roger Mortimer, an English noble who had escaped imprisonment and fled to the continent. Mortimer was ambitious, experienced, and politically astute. Together, Isabella and Mortimer gathered support from English exiles and disaffected nobles. In 1326, they invaded England. Their landing met little resistance. Support for Edward II collapsed rapidly. The Despensers were captured and executed. Hugh Despencer the younger, suffering a particularly brutal death meant as vengeance for his abuses. Edward fled, but was captured in Wales. For the first time in English history, a reigning king was forced to abdicate by his subjects. In January 1327, Edward was deposed in favour of his son, who became Edward III. The official charges against him cited failure in governance, military disaster, and reliance on evil counsellors. Edward II was imprisoned, first at Kenilworth, then at Berkeley Castle. That autumn, in September 1327, he died in captivity. The exact circumstances remain uncertain. Later stories told of a horrific murder involving a heated instrument, but contemporary evidence is less clear. Some sources suggest he died of natural causes or mistreatment. What is certain is that he died as a deposed king, a rare and shocking event in medieval Europe. His death marked the end of a reign, defined by personal loyalty colliding with political reality. Edward II was not a simple villain nor merely a failure. He was a king unsuited to the expectations of his age. He valued friendship deeply, perhaps too deeply for a ruler whose authority depended on balancing powerful factions. He could show generosity and courage, but lacked the steady judgment, military success, and political instinct that medieval kingship demanded. Under his rule, the limits of royal authority became starkly visible. The nobility demonstrated they could resist, reform, and even remove a king. Parliament's role grew, not through theory but through crisis. The events of his reign helped shape the evolving relationship between monarchy and political community in England. His son, Edward III, would restore military glory and royal prestige, but he ruled in a kingdom permanently altered by the trauma of his father's downfall. Edward II's story is not one of triumphant conquest or legal reform, but of fragility at the heart of kingship. He began his reign under the weight of a mighty father's legacy and ended it abandoned, imprisoned, and stripped of his crown. In stone and ceremony, medieval kings seemed uncheckable. Edward II's life revealed how human they truly were and how dangerous it was when personal devotion collided with the ruthless demands of power. His reign remains one of England's great royal tragedies, a tale of affection, resentment, rebellion, and a crown that proved heavier than the man who wore it. When Edward III became King of England in 1327, he was only 14 years old, a boy placed upon a throne still warm from his father's fall. Behind him lay scandal, rebellion, and the unprecedented deposition of a crowned king. His father, Edward II, had been overthrown, imprisoned, and dead within months. Power did not rest in the young king's hands, but in those of his mother, Isabella of France, and her ally and lover, Roger Mortimer. England was ruled not by a warrior king, but by a regency born of invasion and political betrayal. Yet from this fragile beginning would rise one of the most formidable and consequential reigns in English history. Edward III's 50-year rule would reshape England's monarchy, ignite the 100 Years' War, revive chivalric culture, strengthen Parliament's financial role, and leave a legacy of glory and strain that echoed long after his death. His life was a transformation from puppet king to warrior monarch. From shadowed youth to the embodiment of medieval kingship, Edward was born in 1312, the son of Edward II and Isabella. His childhood unfolded during one of the most unstable periods in English royal history. He witnessed firsthand the resentment toward the Despensers, the humiliation of his mother, and the political storms that swallowed his father's rule. These early years formed a king deeply aware of the dangers of weak authority. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England, claiming to act in the young prince's name. The regime of Edward II collapsed almost without resistance. By January 1327, Edward II was forced to abdicate, and the boy was crowned Edward III. But the crown was not yet his. Mortimer governed as the real power behind the throne. He enriched himself, secured titles, and made decisions in the king's name. One of his most controversial actions came in 1328, when he concluded the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton with Robert the Bruce of Scotland. The treaty recognised Scottish independence and renounced its English claims, terms many English nobles viewed as humiliating after decades of war. To young Edward, Mortimer's dominance and the treaty's concessions were bitter reminders that he was king in name only. By 1330, Edward was 18. He had grown into a physically strong, determined young man. Quietly, he gathered loyal companions. In October of that year, he acted with sudden boldness. At Nottingham Castle, Edward and his allies staged a coup. Mortimer was arrested. Isabella was spared, but removed from power. Mortimer was tried for treason and executed. With this decisive stroke, Edward III seized his kingship. The reign that followed would be defined by war, pageantry, and political evolution. One of Edward's earliest goals was to reassert English influence in Scotland. War resumed, and in 1333, Edward won a major victory at the Battle of Halidon Hill. English longbowmen devastated Scottish forces, proving again the deadly effectiveness of English archery tactics. Though Scotland would remain fiercely resistant, Edward's campaigns restored English prestige. But it was across the Channel that Edward would make his greatest gamble. Edward's mother, Isabella, was a French princess. Through her, Edward had a claim, however disputed, to the French throne after the death of his maternal uncle, Charles IV of France, in 1328. The French nobility instead chose Philip VI, beginning the Valois dynasty. Initially, Edward paid homage for his lands in Gascony, but tensions grew. Conflicts over feudal rights, trade in the Channel, and French support for Scotland fueled hostility. In 1337, Edward III formally asserted his claim to the French crown. The 100 Years' War began. This conflict would not be a single continuous war, but a series of campaigns spanning generations. Yet Edward III's early offensives set its tone. He formed alliances with rulers in the Low Countries, seeking to pressure France from multiple fronts. The war demanded enormous funds, leading Edward to rely increasingly on Parliament for taxation, a development that strengthened Parliament's institutional role. Military innovation defined the early victories. English armies combined disciplined infantry with masses of longbowmen capable of unleashing rapid, armor-piercing volleys. These tactics proved devastating against French knights. In 1340, Edward won a major naval victory at the Battle of Sluys, destroying much of the French fleet and securing control of the English Channel. This victory protected England from invasion and ensured safe passage for English armies. The most famous triumph came in 1346. Edward led an army into Normandy, devastating the countryside in a chevauchée-mounted raids designed to weaken French resources and provoke battle. Near the village of Crécy, the French king confronted him with a much larger force. At the Battle of Crécy, English longbowmen, positioned defensively, shattered repeated French cavalry charges. The French suffered enormous losses. It was a landmark victory, demonstrating that disciplined infantry and missile troops could overcome feudal cavalry. The campaign continued with the Siege of Calais, which fell to the English in 1347. Calais became a vital English foothold on the continent, held for more than 2 centuries. During this period, Edward cultivated the ideals of chivalry. In 1348, he founded the Order of the Garter, a prestigious knighthood celebrating martial honor and loyalty. Tournaments, heraldry, and courtly ceremony flourished. Edward fashioned his court as a revival of Arthurian legend, strengthening bonds among the warrior elite. But glory came at a terrible price. In 1348 to 1350, the Black Death swept through England. The plague killed perhaps 1/3 to half of the population. Villages emptied. Labour became scarce. The social and economic order was shaken to its core. Edward's government responded with the Statute of Labourers, 1351, attempting to freeze wages and bind workers to pre-plague conditions and effort to control the upheaval. War resumed in the 1350s, now led in part by Edward's son, Edward of Woodstock, known as the Black Prince. In 1356, the Black Prince captured King John II of France at the Battle of Poitiers, another stunning English victory. The capture of a reigning king elevated English bargaining power enormously. The result was the Treaty of Bretigny, 1360. Edward renounced his claim to the French crown temporarily in exchange for vast territories in southwestern France, held in full sovereignty. It was the high water mark of Edward's continental power, yet holding these lands proved difficult. French resistance revived under Charles V of France, who avoided pitched battles and instead retook territory through strategy and patience. English control in France eroded during the later years of Edward's reign. At home, Edward's later life was marked by aging, personal loss, and political strain. His beloved queen, Philippa of Hainault, died in 1369. Many of his closest companions from his early campaigns were gone. The Black Prince fell ill and died in 1376, a devastating blow, as he had been heir and military hero. Court politics grew troubled. Edward's affection turned toward Alice Perrers, whose influence became controversial. Parliament, increasingly confident, criticized royal spending and corruption. The Good Parliament of 1376 sought reforms and impeached royal officials, an early example of parliamentary assertiveness. By the time Edward III died in 1377, He had ruled for half a century. His grandson, Richard II, inherited the throne. Edward's reign left a complex legacy. He restored the dignity of kingship after the chaos of his father's fall. He expanded England's role in European politics. He presided over cultural revival, legal development, and parliamentary growth. His military successes brought glory, but also committed England to a long, draining continental struggle. He embodied the ideal of the medieval warrior king, brave, charismatic, devoted to honor and lineage. Yet the very wars that defined his greatness also strained the kingdom's finances and sowed future unrest. Edward III's life was an arc from uncertainty to magnificence. He began as a boy overshadowed by scandal and ended as a monarch whose name was linked with Crecy, Calais, chivalry, and the rebirth of English confidence. If Edward II revealed how fragile a crown could be, Edward III showed how powerful it could become in the hands of a determined king. His reign stands as one of England's grand epics, a time when banners flew across France, when the longbow reshaped battlefields, and when a once threatened monarchy rose again to command the stage of Europe. In 1330, the same year his father, Edward III, seized power from the regency of Mortimer and Isabella, a son was born who would grow to embody the very spirit of England's martial revival. This child, Edward of Woodstock, later known to history as the Black Prince, would never wear the crown of England, yet he would become one of the most celebrated warrior figures of the Middle Ages. His life was forged in war, shaped by chivalry, and shadowed by the slow, cruel grip of illness. He lived in the blaze of glory and died before the throne he was destined to inherit. Through him, the ideals of medieval knighthood reached their most dramatic expression. Edward was the eldest son of Edward III and Philippa of Hainault. From birth he stood at the centre of England's future. His childhood unfolded not in a quiet court, but in a realm preparing for continental conflict. His father's claim to the French throne in 1337 had begun what we call the 100 Years' War, and the prince grew up in a culture that glorified military prowess. At age 7, he was created Earl of Chester, 1333, a traditional title for the heir. In 1337, he was made Duke of Cornwall, one of the earliest English dukedoms. His identity was already inseparable from the monarchy. His education was aristocratic and martial. He learned governance, languages, courtly manners, and above all, the arts of war. The revival of chivalric culture under Edward III meant the young prince was raised in an atmosphere filled with tournaments, heraldry, and Arthurian symbolism. The king consciously modelled his course on legendary ideals of knighthood, and his son was to be the living symbol of that vision. The prince's first taste of real war came astonishingly early. In 1346, at only 16, Edward accompanied his father on the campaign that would produce one of the most decisive battles of the Middle Ages, Crecy. The English army, deep in French territory after a destructive raid across Normandy, took up a defensive position. The prince commanded a division of the army, nominally but symbolically important. When French forces attacked, waves of knights charged uphill against English positions anchored by longbowmen. The fighting was brutal. At one point, the prince's position came under severe pressure. A messenger reportedly asked the king for reinforcements. Edward III is said to have refused, declaring that his son must win his spurs. Whether embellished or not, the prince remained in command as the English lines held. Crecy ended in catastrophic defeat for France. The English longbow, disciplined formations, and defensive tactics crushed the traditional cavalry charges. The young prince emerged from the battle with a reputation for courage under fire. The path of his life had been set. The victory was followed by the long siege of Calais 1346–47. Calais fell and became England's key continental stronghold. These early campaigns placed the prince at the centre of England's military elite and confirmed him as a leader of men. The 1350s would make him legendary. In 1355, now in his mid-20s, the prince led a major campaign in southern France. From the English-held Duchy of Aquitaine, he launched a devastating mounted raid, a chevauchée, across Languedoc. These operations aimed not just at plunder, but at breaking the enemy's economy and morale. Towns burned, resources were destroyed, and French defences were stretched thin. The following year brought his greatest triumph. In 1356, during another campaign in southwestern France, the prince found himself confronted by the army of King John II of France. The French forces outnumbered the English, yet the prince, like his father before him, chose defensive ground near Poitiers. The battle that followed mirrored Crécy, but was no mere repetition. English longbowmen again tore into advancing French troops. Discipline and positioning proved decisive. When the fighting ended, the English had achieved an astonishing result. King John II was captured. The capture of a reigning French king transformed the war. The prince's fame soared across Europe. He was seen as the model of knightly virtue, brave, commanding, successful against odds. The victory at Poitiers paved the way for negotiations that produced the Treaty of Bretigny 1360. England gained vast territories in southwestern France in full sovereignty, and Edward III temporarily renounced his claim to the French crown. At this moment, the Black Prince stood at the height of his glory. He soon married Joan of Kent in 1361. Their marriage was controversial. Joan had a complex marital history and was closely related to the prince, but it was a love match. She would be a steady presence in his life. In 1362, the prince was given rule over the enlarged Principality of Aquitaine. He established his court at Bordeaux, governing a territory larger than any previously held by an English heir. He attempted to rule as a sovereign prince, holding courts, issuing charters, and administering justice. But Aquitaine proved politically fragile. Local nobles resisted heavy taxation needed to support defense. The prince's style of governance, modeled on English authority, clashed with regional traditions. Then came a campaign that would mark the turning point of his life. In 1367, the prince intervened in the civil war in Castile. The deposed king, Pedro of Castile, Pedro the Cruel, sought his help against his rival, Henry of Trastamara, who was backed by France. The campaign was grueling. The prince led his army across the Pyrenees and won the Battle of Noguera 1367, restoring Pedro. But the campaign was financially disastrous. Pedro failed to pay the promised sums. The army suffered from harsh conditions. Most significantly, the prince appears to have contracted a serious illness, possibly dysentery or another chronic condition, that would haunt him for the rest of his life. From this point onward, his strength declined. Meanwhile, France recovered under Charles V. Instead of risking large battles, Charles used strategy, alliances, and attrition to erode English control in France. Discontent in Aquitaine grew. Heavy taxation led some nobles to appeal to the French king. War resumed. The prince, increasingly ill, struggled to respond. Though still feared, he could no longer lead campaigns with the vigor of his youth. The English position in France began to shrink. By the early 1370s, his health forced him to return to England. His role shifted from battlefield commander to political figure. He supported calls for reform in government during the Good Parliament of 1376, which sought to address corruption and financial mismanagement. Tragedy struck again. His eldest son, Edward of Angoulême, died young. His second son, Richard of Bordeaux, would later become Richard II. But in 1376, before his father, the Black Prince himself died. He was only about 46. His death shook England. He had been the embodiment of royal hope and military pride. When Edward III died the following year, the crown passed not to a seasoned warrior, but to a child, Richard II. The prince's legacy is powerful and paradoxical. He was a brilliant commander, whose victories at Crécy and Poitiers defined English military prestige. He exemplified chivalric ideals and his reputation for personal courage and leadership endured for centuries. Yet his later campaigns also reveal the limits of glory. The financial strain of war, the resistance of conquered territories, and the relentless counter-strategy of France eroded the gains he had helped win. His illness cut short his ability to adapt and lead. The name Black Prince itself is a later label, not used in his lifetime. Its origin is uncertain, perhaps linked to armor, heraldry, or later legend. But the name endures because it captures something dramatic about him, a figure of brilliance and shadow, triumph and tragedy. Edward of Woodstock lived in the blaze of medieval heroism. He was the Knight Prince of England's golden age of war, the conqueror at Poitiers, the ruler of Aquitaine, and the father of a king. He never wore the crown, yet his life shaped the fate of England and France. In him, the ideals of knighthood reached their most vivid human form, and the cost of those ideals was written in the shortening of his own life. He was 10 years old when the crown of England was lowered onto his head. In 1377, the death of Edward III ended a reign that had stretched across half a century of war, glory, and exhaustion. The Black Prince, the kingdom's great warrior hope, had died the year before, so the throne passed not to a battle-hardened man, but to a child, Richard of Bordeaux, grandson of Edward III, son of the Black Prince, now King Richard II of England. The kingdom he inherited was weary. The 100 Years' War had drained resources, taxes were heavy. The Black Death had shattered society a generation earlier, reducing the population and unsettling the old social order. Labor was scarce, wages were rising, and laws tried to force peasants back into traditional roles. Tension hummed beneath the surface of English life. Richard's early reign was governed by councils and powerful nobles, especially his uncles, most notably John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. But even as a boy, Richard showed a fierce sense of kingship. He believed deeply in the sanctity of monarchy, in the idea that a king ruled by divine right and deserved obedience not just in law, but in spirit. The first great crisis of his reign came not from foreign war, but from within England itself. In 1381, a new poll tax, deeply resented, ignited rebellion. Across southeastern England, peasants and townspeople rose in what became known as the Peasants' Revolt, led by figures like Wat Tyler and inspired by radical preaching from John Ball. The rebels demanded an end to serfdom, lower taxes, and sweeping reforms. They marched on London. The capital fell into chaos, officials were killed. Royal authority seemed to evaporate. Richard, only 14, faced a moment that would define his image forever. He rode out to meet the rebels. At Mile End, he promised concessions. Soon after, at Smithfield, Wat Tyler was killed during tense negotiations. In that instant, the crowd could have turned violent. Instead, Richard rode forward and declared, "I am your captain." His boldness helped defuse the moment. The revolt eventually collapsed. The promises he made were soon revoked. The revolt was suppressed. But the episode shaped Richard profoundly. He had seen how fragile authority could be. It deepened his belief that royal power must be absolute and unquestioned. As he grew older, Richard sought to rule personally. He developed a refined, almost theatrical vision of kingship. His court emphasized ceremony, majesty, and the mystique of monarchy. He surrounded himself with loyal favorites rather than relying solely on the great magnates. This created tension. A group of powerful nobles, later called the Lords Appellant, rose against the influence of Richard's favorites in the late 1380s. They included figures like Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, the king's uncle, and Henry Bolingbroke, son of John of Gaunt. In 1388, during what became known as the Merciless Parliament, several of Richard's close allies were condemned and executed or exiled. The king was humiliated. Though still formally on the throne, his authority had been sharply curtailed. But Richard did not forget. In the 1390s, he regained control. John of Gaunt's influence waned. The king matured, and for a time, his rule seemed more stable. He pursued peace with France, culminating in a truce and his marriage in 1396 to Isabella of Valois, daughter of the French king. She was a child bride, and the marriage was political. Yet Richard's concept of kingship grew increasingly autocratic. He punished former opponents. In 1397, he struck back at the Lords Appellants. Gloucester was arrested and died in custody. Others were exiled or executed. Richard asserted his authority with severity. Then came the crisis that would destroy him. In 1399, John of Gaunt died. His son, Henry Bolingbroke, had been exiled after a dispute with another noble. Richard seized Bolingbroke's inheritance, the vast Lancastrian estates. This was a shocking move. It undermined the rights of the nobility and suggested that no property was safe from royal will. While Richard was on campaign in Ireland, Bolingbroke returned to England. He claimed at first to seek only his rightful inheritance, but support for him grew rapidly. Many nobles feared Richard's arbitrary rule. Richard returned to find his power evaporating. He was captured, forced to abdicate, and imprisoned. Bolingbroke took the throne as Henry IV, beginning the Lancastrian dynasty. Richard II died in captivity in 1400, likely at Pontefract Castle. The exact circumstances remain uncertain, but he probably died of starvation or was killed. He was only 33. His reign is one of the most complex in English history. He was intelligent, cultured, and deeply conscious of royal dignity. He patronized art and architecture, and under him the English court became more elaborate and self-consciously majestic. But his belief in the near-sacred authority of kings clashed with the political realities of late medieval England, where powerful nobles expected a share in governance. His punishments of rivals, his financial demands, and his seizure of Bolingbroke's inheritance eroded trust. Richard II was not a failed king in the simple sense. He was a king ahead of his time in imagining a more centralized, exalted monarchy, but he lacked the political base to sustain it. His fall showed that even an anointed king could be deposed. His life has echoed through history and literature. Shakespeare's Richard II later portrayed him as poetic, tragic, and doomed, a ruler who understood the pageantry of kingship but misjudged the hard calculus of power. Richard's reign marked a turning point. His deposition broke the idea that the English crown passed only by unquestioned hereditary right. It opened the path to dynastic conflict that would later erupt in the Wars of the Roses. He began as a child king who faced rebellion with courage. He ended as a monarch undone by the very vision of kingship he held most dear. In Richard II, medieval England saw both the splendor and the fragility of royal power, a crown that glittered and then fell,